Hi, well, good morning. My name is Alex Brown. I'll be the moderator for this particular panel. I want to thank all that are in participation for joining this infrastructure series specifically focused on cybersecurity. The COVID pandemic has introduced a series of firsts with respect to cyber and cybersecurity. Particularly, I don't know that our nation has ever seen on the federal side or the private sector side, the scale at which access to systems via BYOD devices, I don't think we've seen this. I am particularly happy to have with us today a number of individuals that can talk to us a little bit about the challenges that they're seeing and the way that they're handling those challenges, both from the public and private sector of things. So before we jump in with questions, let me introduce our panelists. We have with us Ms. Jennifer Franks. She's the Director of IT and Cybersecurity with the Government Accountability Office. We also have with us Mr. Kenneth Bible. He is the Chief Information Security Officer with the Department of Homeland Security. And rounding out this group, we have with us Mr. Sean Frazier, the Federal CSO for Okta. And again, my name is Alex Brown, and I'll be the moderator for this event. So let's dive in. And this question is for the group. Just curious to know, what are the biggest current challenges you are seeing with respect to the mobile IT security infrastructure? I gotta imagine with so many individuals that are teleworking and the scale at which that is happening and using various devices, what are some of the challenges that you are seeing? Miss Jennifer, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. I just knew you were going to start with Kenneth over at DHS. I'm sure his challenges definitely far outweigh, from an oversight perspective. But yes, I'm happy to go, and I'm happy to be here today. So some of the biggest concerns really are centered around our employees and the need to really seamlessly still conduct the business needs of the various organizations we serve. Since employees were no longer inside the physical facilities, we had to really make a way for the agency's computing resources to still be accessed in this now maximized telework environment. Some of the considerations to really think about is, are our homes secure? Whether we're teleworking close to the offices or not, our homes present different levels of sensitivities that may not be as secure as working inside federal government agencies and the private sector agencies as well. And those adversaries that are out there trying to really create some havoc onside the government's efforts, they really could seek to compromise the VPNs of the individuals of these various employees. And that can really have some really long lasting effects into the cybersecurity environment.
Gotcha. Thank you. Kenneth, would you chime in on that?
Yeah, no, Jennifer makes a great point about really there's two aspects to this. One is kind of the mission side. And of course, DHS has this plethora of missions that involve interacting with the public. And so how do we make sure that their access to the capabilities through their own mobile devices, that they've got a level of assurance that the things that they're accessing from the department are secure and that their data is being properly handled. You started off the conversation, Alex, talking about BYOD, and I'm not sure that is the right place to focus, although there is a proliferation of different devices and the ability to go connect up from the telework environment. The challenges are perhaps more fundamental, right? There's a difference in cyber hygiene, as Jennifer brought out, in terms of working at home versus working in the office. And so one of the first things that I started to notice, having come in from outside of DHS, was looking at the training that we were providing employees as they came in. The new employee orientation that I took myself was perhaps a little thin in terms of how to go handle a telework environment. So really fundamentally, going back to basics, how are we telling the employees what is appropriate to do in their telework environment? And then there's a new realm of threats, particularly with smartphones and the like, that perhaps we haven't had to deal with particularly. One of the things that's starting to gain some visibility for me right now is this idea of smishing, or use of SMS techniques in order to go get at credentials, which can then be used to compromise the VPNs that we talked about before, that Jennifer mentioned. And so I think there's a new set of threats that we have to think about. It's not so much about BYOD as much as is thinking about what does the mobile environment and telework add to the threat surface that we have to deal with. And so it's about employee education as well as about securing devices. So I would say the challenges in my mind were around how do I appropriately train the employees about how to go telework and what they can and cannot connect up to their GFE device when they're in a telework environment, as well as this idea that there are some new threat vectors that are being introduced as a result of the proliferation of mobile devices. So I would kind of characterize it a little bit more in that way than particularly around BYOD.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Sean?
Yeah, I think certainly there are a lot of challenges, a lot of dimensions. BYOD is one dimension, although I think, as Jennifer pointed out, it's not just about those devices anymore. Now it's about the home office. It's about the personal printers. It's about the personal networking gear. You know, a good friend of mine said he went from 100 remote offices to 10,000 remote offices overnight. So you got to think of that kind of securing holistically, right? It's a much bigger deal. Although I think we've always kind of needed to be there. You know, one of the things that I think has happened is our eyes were kind of open to the fact that ever since we connected our agencies to the internet 20 plus years ago, and ever since mobile devices came about 10 plus years ago, we've lived under this false sense of security that everything inside the network was protected, everything outside the network was bad. But as soon as we connected to the internet, that was all done. We all live in the same neighborhood now. The attackers all are in the same neighborhood. We've been pretending they haven't been there. And I think this has forced us to focus on protection where protection needs to be, which is at the data, wherever that data is. And in most cases now it's outside the network, whereas, you know, before it was inside the network. So some of the use cases, and you know, Jennifer, I think, talked a little bit about TIC and some of the other stuff, is some of the use cases are kind of supporting the fact that, you know, if you need to go back inside the network, VPN is a great mechanism for that. But if you don't need to go back inside the network, then why go back inside the network? You know, have that mobile device outside the network protected, have it accessing data delivered through a cloud service, through, you know, some kind of workload in a cloud service that's outside the network, and making sure that that conversation is protected. So in some ways, I see opportunity, lots of challenges, but the opportunity is, hey, we're awake now, protect stuff.
Sean, let me jump in on that point a little bit. I mean, he's exactly right. This idea that the users are demanding a more seamless experience to be able to get access to the systems that they have. And, you know, some of that is around how do I get access directly to a cloud service rather than having to make a U-turn coming through a VPN and then pop out the other side to the cloud service. But that is, you know, to the point. There's no single solution that's going to answer that cybersecurity architecture, and really thinking through what do we need to do in order to have an assurance that the device that's actually connecting up to that service is valid into the environment, or that user, if we can actually get to that true ICAM kind of approach, understand that user is appropriate and the device is appropriate and appropriately configured and patched before we allow it to then connect to that resource. So a great point, but it isn't a single thing. There's no magic bullet. There's just a lot of work that has to be done to think through the use cases and lay it out.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Kenneth, you appropriately pointed out that BYOD is just one component, right, of several, you know, with respect to the broader perspective of securing the infrastructure. And I can appreciate that, and I certainly do agree. However, it is, you know, getting a great deal of traction just by virtue of the fact that individuals are outside of the office space. They're moving about their day, not always at home and in front of their computer. So how does the notion of zero trust and architectures that support that enable federal employees to leverage BYOD?
Yeah, well, I think that's really where I was going with respect to that architecture discussion previously about how does an employee get access to those resources directly without having to come back through a VPN. And the real rub is it's not a single solution. There's no magic box I can buy that gives me zero trust, right? There's no magic software I can buy that gives me zero trust. It's a concerted effort to go design an architecture that would allow me to take, whether it's a GFE device or my personal iPhone, and have that identity be able to be identified to the network and to be able to provide that security that we need. Certainly there are mechanisms out there in some environments today, fairly isolated to specific software as a service solutions or the like. But it's very difficult to kind of find the solution package or the architecture that gives you this broad-ranging access to all the range of things that your stakeholders might want to use. But that is the goal. I mean, that zero trust is the architectural premise that I think we're all recognizing that we have to go after as mobile becomes more of the norm rather than the exception. We're no longer thinking about it or trying to move past thinking about it as a perimeter defense and more around, hey, where's the data? How do we protect the data? Who's the individual trying to access the information? And how do we put those two together to make an access decision?
Gotcha. And,
yeah, I would say that the perimeter's been gone for a long time. The perimeter doesn't exist anymore. And I look at zero trust as an inevitability. And I also look, just like Kenneth said, it's not a product, it's a lifestyle choice. It is a mindset change in the way you do security. And 10 years from now, we're not going to call it zero trust. We're just going to call it security, because this is the way security has had to adapt to this connected world we live in, right? It's the mobile world, it's the cloud world. And the more we move in that direction, the more zero trust is really the only kind of philosophy around security that's going to protect us.
And I agree with you, Sean. I think it is the lifestyle choice, and it is the path that we're headed on, just as a function of where technology is going. But I don't see anybody piling up their routers and switches and perimeter defenses yet, right? So I think we have to understand that right now, it's not a clean architecture to be able to kind of rip out one and as I place another one in place. The challenge we face is that right now it's somewhat additive on top of what we're doing at the perimeter, while we gain our experience level and understand how to operate in that new construct of zero trust, and then be able to pull out those underlying pieces in order to make it affordable. So I think that's the fundamental challenge that I see, is just how do we make that transition from the past, the perimeter bastion defense architecture, into zero trust, and how do we make that affordable for our respective agencies?
Right.
And then I like to add from both conversations by Kenneth and Sean, the one piece they didn't mention is that, yes, it is going to be a lifestyle and will present a huge culture change across the federal government and the private sector. But what's very important that we see at GAO and then alike in the OIG community is that the senior leadership of the agencies and organizations really have to work to understand what's at stake with the cybersecurity and the IT professionals. Without that, there would be a lack of awareness of why there's a need to be more resilient, more consistent, and more responsive to these new cyber attacks that continue to happen.
Yeah, you mentioned the C word, culture, and I think you're exactly right. That's the one that people don't always think about. And you've got culture from two dimensions. You've got the end user culture, which has this high expectation of usability, right? They're used to iPhones, they're used to paying for things in Starbucks with Face ID. But then you have what I call kind of the stalwart security culture in an agency and organization, which is, this is the way we've done it. I wrap my hands around a server. This is my security protection. So unlocking that culture and kind of pulling that apart and saying, okay, the culture of security internally has to change. Super important and super hard.
But so that, to that point, and I think it's a powerful point, is that the role of the CISO in the federal government has to be that executive that can translate the technical speak to the senior leadership to understand that challenge, right? Because in the past, in the cybersecurity world, we tended to come in with a bunch of compliance statistics and, how many POA and EMS are we tracking, and where are we at with respect to our FISMA scores. That has limited appreciation in terms of being able to shape a business decision. So I think that's a really powerful point about the CISO skill set. How do we start to go build CISOs that actually have the ability to have that conversation around the risk and around where the organization needs to go, and be in those conversations with the most leaders of the organization.
And not
only
only
that on the commercial side as well.
not only being that translator, but also given the power to make decisions around
Yes.
those things. Because we see that not just public sector, we see it in the private sector where CISOs are sometimes overridden by lawyers, overridden by finance, and they're making financial decisions and they're making legal decisions. And what they have to realize is security is the thread that binds all of that together.
Great. Hey, well, let's move on. That was interesting dialogue. Kenneth, I'm gonna pick on you here a little bit. You talked about the role of the federal CISO. You began with DHS at a precarious time, right? Almost right in the middle of the pandemic. And you talked a little bit about coming on board and taking training, and it didn't measure up to your expectations. Question for you, how did starting at that time shape your thinking about what the priorities for the organization would be, and how is it shaping your activities going forward?
Yeah, so I appreciate that question. I mean, it is kind of interesting to step into a new organization, and I've used this in kind of shaping the conversation I have about that transition coming out of the Department of Defense environment. So I have almost 100% telework, virtually 100% telework. I've got COVID, so I've got employees who are dealing with their own situations with their families and the like. We've got maybe one of the largest cyber incidents that the nation has ever experienced with what happened in SolarWinds, and doing all of this as the new guy on the block, right? But I'll tell you, it does give you a great ability to think about what's important. And so go back to kind of first principles. The only reason that I can be successful as a CISO is because I've got good staff. And so how do I take care of the people? Number one, how do I build that workforce, and how do I keep that workforce going in the midst of everything that's going on around them? The second is finding what are those key areas that I need to actually mature within the cybersecurity architecture and the means by which I go do that. I happen to have a CISO council from across the DHS components, and trying to recast that as a decision-making body to make recommendations to the CIO and the CIO council. So really trying to go mature this process whereby the CISO and the CISOs from the components can make substantive recommendations on where the organization should make investments. And that wasn't necessarily fully baked when I came on board. I think we're making great strides in that regard. So workforce, the kind of getting organized for the battle, understanding how do you use the CISO council, how do I use the organization to move the needle. And then there were a couple of things that, maybe one in particular that I saw as kind of a critical element for me in the seat, particularly in light of SolarWinds, which was really starting to get a better understanding of the supply chain and supply chain risk management. And so I dove into that challenge, really talking about what could the department start to do, developed up kind of a 4-pronged plan for how the department could start tackling that issue, and partnering up with CISA and talking about what they envision being able to do across the federal government. But really trying to find that kind of an initiative that I could go spearhead to go help move the needle with respect to our cybersecurity posture. And certainly SolarWinds and then the follow-on pieces with Exchange, kind of signaled that how we make decisions and the things that we choose to go put into the environment are incredibly important, especially as new things are being created every day, and we tend to go grab the capability, the neat new thing to go shove into the environment. But as a cybersecurity professional, I really want to understand what's the provenance of that, what's the composition of that, what's the integrity of it through its life cycle, because those become the longer term risks to the organization. Does that help?
Yeah, I think that the only thing I think that's awesome.
It does. It helps tremendously.
I'm glad that you're doing the CISO council and kind of injecting security into the decision making in IT, because I think that's super important. I think the other thing you mentioned, which I always talk about, because people talk about cloud as being modernization and being digital transformation, which it is, and they think it's going to save a ton of money. Cloud doesn't really save you a ton of money. What it does is it forces you to focus. So SolarWinds and the Exchange breach, if you have on-prem servers you don't know exist because they're on-prem, they're running in some closet somewhere, that you lose focus because you have a lot of those. I mean, the long tail of legacy gets longer and longer as time goes by. And the more you have it, the more you support it, the more money you got to invest in it. Whereas cloud can kind of force you to focus on what really matters, which is delivering capability, protecting data, and not focus on, I got to upgrade these 10,000 servers.
So Sean, I want to say that I'm in violent agreement with your statement, but I will just focus on one word in that statement. It could. What I find too often is that we're taking legacy systems and dragging them over into the cloud and building velvet ropes around them. And all we're doing is basically running the same thing we were running before in somebody else's infrastructure. But to your point, you know, the opportunity, the could, is to fundamentally change how we build out that capability on top of some standard infrastructure as code, using validated platforms and pipelines for building the code, and focusing the business process owner on the thing that really adds value, which is the code at the top of the stack, rather than on running boxes. And to that end, if we can get to that point, and what I truly believe is the heart of SecDevOps, or you know, I still fall back on my Marine Corps days of calling it DevSecOps, but since security is in our name, it's SecDevOps for Department of Homeland Security. But really being able to go focus in on what's important for the stakeholder and delivering those foundational IT services for that functional community becomes the key to that transformation and modernization you're talking about. That's at least my experience so far. Over. No,
yeah, I think that's true. And I think that, you know, and just forklifting, you know, one old legacy process and putting it in a new platform does not a good solution make.
Doesn't get you anywhere.
It's the same thing on the mobile. It's the same thing on the mobile side when people took kind of non-mobile processes and applications and tried to kind of shoehorn them into the mobile platform and didn't think about, how does it work on an iPad, right? Does it look like an iPad app, or does it look like this old Windows 95 app on an iPad, right? So there's that whole decision on the endpoint stuff, because that you know, that affects user experience. User experience expects usability, and if people aren't going to use it, they don't want to have it.
That's right.
Right. Hey, well, next I'm going to come to you, Jennifer, for this next question. Can you talk a little bit about you know, how keeping classified information classified is almost impossible in the age of telework? I guess you have a perspective on that.
Yes, I do. And I'm sure my colleagues on this call will as well. I wouldn't say it was impossible. There were just some delays at the beginning of the pandemic with how we approached conducting our business across the government and even in the private sector in that classified arena. Many of the agencies with their internal and external stakeholders really had to work with congressional staff, agency officials, and their lawyers, as we talked about, to really rescope the methodologies and shape what it would look like to continue working in such a teleworked home environment. So many efforts likely were suspended and could even still be suspended to this day. But the agencies have really, you know, taken various ways to approach conducting their business that would lend itself to being classified. GAO definitely has started to really look at what needs to be conducted. Still in this environment, we are allowing individuals on a case-by-case basis to have access to either to the field offices or the headquarters offices where they reside to conduct some of this work in person in the SCIFs. DOD has efforts underway, really looking at some of the advanced technologies that are out there that could help them to streamline working in a classified environment. And the Air Force has actually established a technology that they're calling Device One Initiative that really looks at how certain aerospace engineers and the like will be able to really utilize their classified areas of work in the at-home environment. So it's possible, it's being considered. Some of the things that we are considering, or as federal government agency leaders, we should really consider, and I'm sure many of you will have the same ideas or even grow on them, are, you know, to really look at how we could move to conducting more work in the classified environment, but at home in telework, we would have to streamline our agency initiatives to really practice good hygiene, good cyber hygiene, that is, strong vulnerability management, and then really looking at a central network visibility that would be at the top of all of the minds involved to move forward to this enterprise network operation. Working in this area would create perhaps some additional blind spots where the security professionals would have to then navigate. So one of the additional problems that we also need to consider as individuals and agencies start to really consider moving to the classified environment is really considering some of the unclassified work that we are conducting at home in the clear. And I'm saying that to say is there are certain volumes of data, certain types of data and sensitivities that we are likely at home in our personal environments, like they noted, sitting very close to your smartphones all day, your smart TVs, there's gaming consoles in your home, and they could be picking up audio and visual connections where you might think is an unclassified conversation, but the information you're sharing has kind of risen to the totality of being slightly sensitive and could be giving away some tools that your federal agency would like to be protected.
Gotcha. Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. So Alex, I'll just jump on and emphasize there what Jennifer's saying, and maybe one other piece of this is too, regardless of the system access that we have, our oath of office and the access that we're given to classified information is incumbent upon the individual. It's not a function of automatically the system taking care of it. We all have an obligation to protect sensitive information, classified information from disclosure. So I think to the point, it goes to the individual. We all have to be cognizant of it in that remote workplace environment. And as Jennifer talks about, being able to provide access to SCIFs, myself, I drive downtown to get to the SCIF when I need to get access to that type of information. She also touched upon the DoD pieces, and I had benefited some of that when I was over across the river in terms of some of the commercial solutions for classified type capabilities that might be extended to use in broader government application. I'm certainly curious to see what the art of the possible is there, but there was I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there.
Great. Hey, I'm going to move on to a conversation about two very important programs. Kenneth, DHS has had the CDM program underway for, I want to say maybe 5 years, if my memory serves. I'm curious to know if you could speak to how it helps federal agencies, specifically with telework.
Yeah, so let's see, that's interesting. Specifically with telework. Certainly for the GFE devices that we've got out there, we're starting to get a whole lot more asset information coming in. And I'll say that the program started out with the construct of a one DHS model when we started down the implementation path, and it was kind of the idea that we were going to have one solution that all the components were going to go use, and kind of ran up against some challenges there for a couple of reasons. One is just delivery of the program, making the selections and delivering those individual solutions that were supposed to be fielded to everyone. The second was the fact that the technology is changing as you're moving, right? So the idea that we were going to go have the one cocktail of things that was going to solve the problem was perhaps a little bit ambitious at the time. So the shift in that strategy to say, hey, we want to focus more on how do agencies start reporting data in than necessarily a single tool really was a turning point in the program. And again, I'm only 3 months into my tenure here, but even in that time, what I've seen is the asset counts going, it's like 2 orders of magnitude greater in terms of the assets that we're seeing reporting in through CDM, and starting to get into the AWARE tool as a modern dashboard, providing some real analytics around the data. I think to your point about how it supports telework, it's that analytic piece that's going to be powerful to us as we go forward, because we're not simply looking at a static picture of the data, but actually being able to go in and look at and analyze the underlying attributes in the data set. And that's where you get a little bit more fidelity in terms of understanding a mobile device, the types of IP addresses, the addresses that are coming in, you start to be able to see some of those anomalies that perhaps you would not have seen in other contexts.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think one of the things with CDM too is that you focus on continuous, right? So CDM, it was actually brought in when NIST put together 800-207 and talked about zero trust. CDM was an adjunct to that because the continuous nature of the ability to kind of prevent threat and continuous context-based authentication, that was an important point because there's two places where you can use that data. You can use it forensically after the fact, after bad things have happened, or to kind of manage your scorecard on this is how we did. But there's also kind of the mitigating threat at the front door. So being able to continuously do that, continuously validate authentication is one of those core tenets of zero trust.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, I have less experience with that with the ops side of the house, but I could certainly see that, Sean.
Gotcha. Hey, well, listen, we're running up on time, but it's important to me, Jennifer. We talked earlier about the remote desktop platform as a initiative there. And I'd really appreciate just a little insight into it with respect to telework. And then I think we will probably be able to wrap this up.
Okay, that's actually a really good question. GAO for many years now has really been using a virtual desktop infrastructure to conduct its business. This process enables employees to connect to a secure portal using either a government furnished equipment device or their personal devices. And the portal experience is the same for either of the devices. And this centralizes a security checkpoint, so to speak, for the agency's employees and the resources so that they can connect via their various telework locations. By creating a barrier between the virtual and the physical environments, the agency has seen us increase the level of protection that we can offer to our information and resources. And given that this was already in place at the start of the pandemic last year, while only a reduced footprint of employees was teleworking on a daily basis, we were able to maximize telework almost overnight. And like Kenneth said, almost at 100% for sure. To really utilize those telework procedures. Yes, we, like other agencies, had to increase our bandwidth. We had to buy additional devices, such as the web cameras and the like, but the platform itself was already established and in place. And another note, we were already trained to know the at-home use policies, whether you were a teleworker or not. You were already trained annually on what was expected of you in the environment and how you were supposed to kind of maintain a set of security for yourself in your telework environments. So that was actually very helpful. It provided very efficient and effective services for us. And it also has presented some cost savings to GAO in that we can reduce some of the physical footprint, some of the utility costs, and even the transit benefits for the individuals that take, part of the program to commute back and forth into the offices.
Great. Well, listen, this has been particularly lively for me. And I want to say thank you to you, Jennifer, Kenneth, and Sean.
Absolutely.
We appreciate the roles you play within your respective organizations in keeping our country and our assets safe with respect to the cyber threat. And so with that, thanks so much. And we really do look forward to having an opportunity to have conversations with you in the future.